Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My apologies for starting a few minutes late. I think we're all dealing with a new normal, and our new normal for today was some fun little technical issues getting dialed in. But we're here now, you're here, and we're excited to share with you. So welcome to a very special webinar mini-series from the home office brought to you by the Centro Institute. My name is Ryan Manchi. I lead the Centro Institute, and I am so very fortunate to be your host for today. A quick little bit about Centro before we get into it. Centro is a provider of software and services for digital advertisers. Our technology is designed to boost media, team, and business performance by enabling advertisers to plan, buy, and analyze campaigns all on a single platform that we call Basis. We have an amazing team of 700 plus media specialists, data pros, operations wizards, account leaders, and digital experts who provide our clients with raving fan service at every stage of any campaign. I will note a recording of this webinar and these slides will be shared with you, and we will have questions at the end, or we'll have time for questions at the end. I'm so happy that you joined us today as we're in the midst of this webinar series. So last week we kicked this off, and over the next several weeks, we'll continue examining industries in flux. These are industries that are facing unprecedented challenges, but also massive opportunities. So over the next 30 minutes or so, you'll hear some great insights and recommendations based upon some of these new consumer trends and changes that we're seeing from a media consumption perspective and just the wild world that we're living in. And we'll also share some glimmers of hope and some positive change. So last week we kicked off with just kind of the state of the advertising industry. Next week we'll explore pharma and healthcare, consumer packaged goods, and conclude with education and e-learning. But today, I hope you're hungry as we focus on quick serve restaurants. So while most of us are working from home, our experts have not taken any time off, and I'm excited to welcome our two very special expert guests today. So today and for the rest of the series, I'll be joined by April Weeks, who is EVP of Media Strategy and Operations at Centro, and she brings 2 decades of digital media expertise, partnering with clients across nearly every vertical and leading the teams of those media specialists, data pros, operations wizards that I mentioned before. And we're also joined by Amy Rumpler, who is VP of Paid Social at Centro, where she oversees social strategy, execution, and operations on a national level, while also leading a dedicated team of social experts who spend much of their day on Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat, while also planning and executing hundreds of millions of dollars in paid social. I'm very fortunate to call both of these amazing women my colleagues. And with that, let's pull up to the first window, and April will serve up a state of quick service restaurant. April, over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Ryan, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I think as we all know, many industries and categories are experiencing a period of disruption and change due to COVID-19, but certainly the QSR industry is one that is directly being affected and has abruptly had to make several adjustments and changes to serve their consumer base and make sure that we're providing, a good experience overall to consumers as they seek to find alternatives to in-home meal preparation. So today, what Amy and I would like to cover is, first we'll start out with just some high-level industry trends. Then we'll talk a bit about media consumption and how media consumption has continued to change with, the new normal and, remote working locations and families sheltering in place and spending more time at home. And then, we'll wrap up today with just talking a bit about advertising opportunities and specifically the role that we see and believe that social can play. And then we'll leave a little bit of time for Q&A. So as we go through, the next few minutes of content, please think about any questions or things that might be top of mind for you, and we'll be happy to address those at the end of the presentation. So going to the next slide, I think it's first really important to talk about and think about what's top of mind for consumers. Certainly, you've seen a lot of brands kind of adjust their messaging and their advertising approach. And so as a QSR brand, I think it's really important to think about what are some of those to what you're currently doing and thinking about. So, this first statistic I think is really important, with over 40% of consumers saying that food safety is really important to them and something that they do have top of mind. They want to know that various QSR brands and restaurant brands, are taking necessary precautions in terms of safetiness, cleanliness, what are the extra precautions being implemented just to provide, a good consumer experience, not only, through drive-through and takeout, but also for the employees that are working inside, their brands and their restaurants, how are they thinking about taking care of them as well? And then secondarily, almost a quarter have community as top of mind. And you've seen a lot of communication from different brands talking about, charitable efforts, donations, how are they thinking about honoring and recognizing and supporting our healthcare workers that are on the front lines dealing with COVID-19 and, really approaching the situation from a place of empathy and care. And then finally, almost 20% also cite being interested in employee-based initiatives. As we know, specifically in the area of QSR, a large number of the workforce could be hourly employees that are being directly and unfortunately potentially negatively impacted by the current situation. And so, consumers do want to know how brands are reacting and taking care of their employees. And we've seen a lot of that messaging come to fruition over the past few weeks. Another trend that I think is really interesting, if you want to go to the next slide, Ryan, is just to think about what's happening in terms of spending and, the current COVID-19 situation and what that's doing across a number of different industries. And, certainly, there's a lot of negative here on this slide, but, one spot of optimism for the QSR category is in comparison to the restaurant and dine-in experiences, you can see, they are faring better. And often I think that's really because operationally they've been set up to pivot very quickly through drive-through windows, takeout, things of that nature. Whereas, the more traditional dine-in restaurants have had to make more significant adjustments. And because of that, you are seeing, definitely a larger negative impact there. What I think though here is really interesting to think about as a QSR brand is what is the competition in this current state? And while, certainly it is QSR brands that, are putting out special menus or thinking about what the LTOs and limited time offers are, that is certainly, still part of the competitive set. But what's interesting here is grocery and in-home food preparation, where you can see this is the one category that's showing some positive benefit from the current situation. And in doing some research and keeping our pulse on this category across Centro, it was interesting. There was an article from Eater that came out not too long ago talking about delivery service apps for, grocery, things of that nature. And Instacart had seen an increase of over 200% in app downloads between the period of mid-February to mid-March. And then they saw another increase the weekend following when the pandemic actually was declared around COVID-19. So I think as a marketer and an advertiser in the QSR industry, it's really important right now to think about not only who your traditional competition is and what they might be doing from pricing, menu, and their messaging strategy during this time, but also thinking about just consumer mindset and behaviors and how those might be shifting to in-home meal preparation. But in looking at that, there's also, some continued optimism for this category. And on the next slide, as you can see, we're starting to settle into what many consider the new normal. And so, I thought it was interesting to share that, consumers are starting to get a bit more comfortable with meal preparation and bringing food into their homes that's actually prepared outside the home, with 45% stating that they are likely or even more likely to order food from a drive-through. And then I thought this was also just really interesting about behaviors and how people's attitudes and behaviors and really habits start to form. There's a lot of research out there that says that, habits can start forming as easily as 21 days. Depending on the behavior and the habit that's being formed or changed, certainly it can be longer. But I thought this was an interesting stat to share that 60% of consumers have stated that on a consistent basis, they are ordering their dinner from an off-premise location, whether that be a QSR or restaurant, and picking it up at least one time per week. And that's been pretty consistent since the end of February through just a few days ago. So this is fairly recent and timely research. And hopefully, as a QSR brand, there is some optimism that consumers are leaning in and embracing opportunities there. And then just talking a little bit about media consumption, because certainly we are starting to see some changes in how consumers utilize digital devices, social media, with almost 80% saying that they've increased their time spent with at least one digital device. Not surprising, as everybody's sheltering in place and spending more time at home, they're really leaning into digital, and certainly that can create more opportunity for advertising. Not at all surprising, there's numerous data points out there that show the significant increase in streaming, whether that be for TV, your favorite movies, whatever your streaming device partner of choice may be. It's definitely a place where consumers are continuing to lean in and consume more media. And then finally, almost a third are stating increased time with social media sites. And I think that's really an important consideration, especially as I hand this over to Amy, and she outlines what we're seeing at our point of view around some advertising opportunities and the really important role that social could potentially play during this time for QSR brands. So Amy, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, April. So diving in just a little bit deeper, we wanted to take some of those, new habits and trends in this category that April mentioned and help translate that into what we're seeing in terms of shifts in spend, strategy, and creative for QSR advertisers. So over the past several weeks, and specifically in March, our research indicated, and we saw this with our clients specifically as well, that there were definitely some cases where we saw advertisers have an initial pullback in digital spend across some channels, such as audio, for example, as coronavirus took hold. What's really interesting is as that media was paused, many of our QSR clients reported almost immediately that they started seeing negative reactions across social media sites, as that's where people were going to get information to find out whether or not those local restaurants were open, to seek information on changes that they were implementing in service and safety procedures. And also we saw search keyword usage around the same time really start to take off around terms like takeout or pickup, food delivery, and drive-through, which makes sense with many, if not all, restaurants during that time starting to be impacted by new restrictions and consumers really rethinking how they dine both in and out of the home. At the same time, as April just mentioned, engagement and usage across social media started to skyrocket. And so what we saw as these advertisers started to turn their media back on was that they recognized there was an opportunity actually to shift some dollars more into social advertising in order to provide their diners with reassurance. And actually many budgets have continued to grow since then across almost every category within QSR, from sandwiches to hamburgers to pizza and kind of everything in between. And just a quick caveat, this data is based on research that we conducted through a sampling of the top 100 QSR chains across the United States. But it did show an uptick in budgets from the peak spend period in February as compared to the peak spend period at the end of March. And some brands in these categories have actually increased their social buying budgets by 100% or more. Ryan, if you go on to the next slide, I think it's really interesting to think about, though, the fact that the QSR restaurant's love affair with social media began long before coronavirus, and you don't have to look further than the Popeyes chicken sandwich craze to know that that's true. But definitely during these current events, these brands are finding a lot of value in these channels because they have the capability to provide both mass reach and efficient frequency. Since March, we've seen kind of a big shift in strategy for many of these brands, kind of moving away from really driving in-person foot traffic toward trying to get their message in front of as many eyeballs as possible to make sure consumers are aware that they're here to serve them. And what's really interesting is that the social networks themselves have been able to kind of rise to meet this demand with the influx in inventory from usage increases and also a reduction in buying across some other categories and industries at this time. So we've actually seen quite a bit of improvement in efficiency in CPMs across many of the social publishers. Just an example, Facebook rates between March and April, from what we're seeing, have reduced by upwards of 30%. And then if you also think, as April mentioned, about all the time being spent with online video and video streaming, I don't think it's a surprise that we're also seeing a ton of efficiencies in more video forward platforms such as Snapchat, where we've actually seen a reduction in up to 50% of CPM rates over the last 6 weeks. So I think it makes a lot of sense that these brands are coming to these platforms, in addition, of course, to leaning into other video forward channels like programmatic video, connected TV, and even YouTube. On the next slide, Ryan, taking a little bit of a step deeper, we wanted to look at how QSR strategy specifically has evolved over this time period. And that's also helpful, I think, as April mentioned, to think about how coronavirus has evolved as a whole. So when we first entered this pandemic, there were a lot of differences in which restaurants were staying open versus which were closing, what operational hours were going to be like, what types of services they were still able to provide. And a lot of that was due to regional differences in terms of how social distancing requirements were rolling out at the time. So it was very important in the beginning that restaurants took an educational stance in each individual market as to providing diners with the latest updates, because not every market was necessarily going to be the same. So we saw that almost immediately translated into updates in creative, as you can see with kind of some of the examples here on the screen. But still today, there are absolutely differences in how QSRs are being hit from one market to the other. And so we're also seeing behind the scenes that some advertisers are starting to rethink how they can be more nimble with their national marketing dollars or their marketing funds, potentially even shifting some of those dollars to support specific markets and specific locations that need the most assistance at any given time. And while some brands are definitely starting to pause or delay new location openings, we're also seeing others move full steam ahead. And we haven't seen yet a huge shift in terms of the call to action being used in these ads. So in these social examples, you can see here, a couple of them are still directing to get directions to the nearest location. And we've also seen a lot of success in using Google local campaigns to help drive people to their nearby fast food restaurant when they're searching for information on restaurants that are open. While we are still tracking foot traffic with those Google local campaigns, we've noticed that results have continued to increase week over week, even as stay-at-home orders became more strict. So there definitely is still a need and a want inside these consumers to have the option to go out and to order carry out or drive through if possible. Copy has definitely been edited across the board to focus more on delivery as an option as well. And another big evolution in QSR strategy is that these restaurants are starting to shift more of their dollars into promoting third-party delivery options, which I think is not surprising because those services as well are definitely increasing their advertising budgets currently as consumers rely more and more on them than ever before. But if you think about the massive amount of added value that ads like this Burger King Grubhub ad are providing to those, third-party delivery services, it's really amazing to think about that partnership growing. And I think that these are all really good illustrations, really, of how these brands are having to remain nimble and make edits to their messaging and their strategy as this Corona situation has continued to evolve. On the next slide, Ryan, you can see that there are many other keywords and themes that are also starting to pop in QSR ads and social ads specifically across the board. Obvious things like contactless delivery, curbside pickup, carryout, drive-through. We see those terms, in nearly every ad these days. What's really interesting is some QSRs, like this Wendy's example, for example, are really starting to lean in more heavily to promote new day parts as well, to look for new opportunities to capture revenue. So things like promoting breakfast menu items for delivery, which is an area that they may not have fully explored or fully promoted before. There are also some subtle differences between the QSR chains who were set up for delivery prior to COVID and those that have had to move faster to kind of adapt their strategy. And we're seeing more aggressiveness from those types of brands in terms of promoting value offerings specifically, as you can see in this 3-topping large pizza deal from Pizza Hut. Other restaurants have also started to adapt the strategy, absolutely, and are taking more of a family bundle meal deal approach, which is interesting because searches for the term meal deal are also up more than 200% from February to April. And finally, we're seeing many QSRs starting to run app download campaigns to highlight the benefits of using their app to order ahead. So using a phone to place your order is obviously much safer than using a kiosk because it's touchless and it supports social distancing measures. So that's resonating very well with diners right now. But also research has shown that the average amount of time for an order to be filled for pickup when ordered ahead is 2.4 times faster than an order placed through the drive-thru right now. So not only is it beneficial for the consumer, they can get in, they can get out, it's beneficial for the restaurant as well. And finally, on the last slide here, as April mentioned, I think it's been really refreshing to see that many of these large global brands are engaging more with their local communities and sharing content that really shows how sensitive they are to not only the current environment, but the personal experiences of diners and their employees as well. It's obviously been a very hard time for everyone. And these brands don't have to be overly salesy at this point to get people in the door. Fast food is a comfort food. It's easy, it's inexpensive. They want to be able to show that it's safe as well. But by sharing impactful stories like these and talking about how they're donating meals, recognizing community heroes, I think they're likely building much more long-lasting brand loyalty, as well as helping to reassure people in the short term. So I think all of these things together definitely make you wonder not only where this industry will be months or years from now, but also which of these changes and new attitudes between the consumers and the QSR themselves will really impact us all for the long term. And, even more importantly, how this changes the expectations of QSR diners. And that's it for me, Ryan. I think we're ready to take some questions if we have any.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. A lot of information packed in the last 20 minutes or so. We do have the time now dedicated towards the questions that you all have. I see that a few of you have found it, but there should be a questions tab in that GoToWebinar console. If you've got a question for Amy or April or for both of them, based upon something that they covered, or maybe something that they didn't cover that you were hoping to hear more about, we'll dig right in. I think one of the let's see here. One of the first questions that we've got here is around types of targeting. Amy, maybe this is one for you. What shifts have you seen in the types of targeting some of these QSR advertisers are using to reach people during COVID-19?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take that one. I think, one thing to keep in mind is, again, these brands really at this point, as opposed to looking for, those hard sales or in-restaurant visits, are focused on reach and efficiency. And for that reason, getting that message in front of as many people as possible is beneficial during this time period. So we have seen a little bit of, I would say, a relaxation in terms of the type of targeting that advertisers are using, going with things that are a little more broad. So more broad competitive interests, as April mentioned, and not just targeting other QSR chains in your targeting, but also other restaurant type terms. And then from a geography standpoint, we've also seen some shifts there, as delivery fulfillment needs change, then we're seeing some advertisers start to expand or contract their geography targeting accordingly to make sure that they're reaching the people who actually are most available to order delivery or takeout from that location.
It's great. It's excellent. A couple of questions about if the recording's going to be available. Yes, we'll have a recording as well as the slides and send those out. Let's see how many more that we can get in here. A couple of questions around some of the mobile strategy. Amy, I know you kind of talked to mobile downloads, app download campaigns, but have you seen an increase, I guess, across the board with more specifically with mobile advertising for QSRs?
Definitely. We've also seen a lot of QSRs testing out new mobile forward platforms. So things like TikTok or Snapchat, for example, knowing that those are platforms that users or potential diners are really going to for a little bit of an escape and entertainment during this time period. So I think, again, speaking back to the consumption habits that April mentioned in the beginning, knowing how much more time people are spending not only on mobile, but on all digital devices. Yes, we've seen an expansion in mobile, but also an expansion of things like connected TV and podcasts, as podcast growth is up right now with people listening at home.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's been amazing to see, that kind of the shift where there's some of the things that you would expect, but then maybe a few surprises there as people are kind of reacting. I'm going to move on to this question from Cameron. And it touches on actually some of the conversation that the three of us had kind of in preparation. So I'll just read his and maybe add a little bit more color. Amy touched on this a little on the last slide, but how much pressure will it be for QSRs to keep offering these themes, these deals after COVID-19 is over and as consumers become used to this level of convenience? And how will this impact these companies if they continue to offer these cheaper options? I'm interested in that, and also like other like strategic, even if it's related to logistics and how many of these restaurants are set up, even their actual locations. Any thoughts there, maybe Amy, and then we can go to April to kind of speak to some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say, it's kind of in some ways too hard to tell at this point, but it's interesting to think about what the future of this category could look like, just based again on the habits that we're all forming through this time period. April kind of spoke to this a little bit early in the presentation as well, but I think in general, people are becoming a lot more comfortable with, ordering through the mobile app as opposed to ordering at the drive-through kiosk. I think carryout and curbside delivery is one thing that could potentially carry long past this, as that becomes, A, convenience, and B, kind of an expectation of how they interact with these restaurants. And then the last thing that, I would say that I've been kind of interested in, I mentioned that some of these brands are starting to put a pause on new store openings and also construction. It's interesting to think about whether or not these trends will impact things like the footprint inside the restaurant. And is it possible that in the future, there will be less dine-in space and more space devoted to things like takeout counters, more parking lot space devoted to curbside pickup, those types of things. I think there definitely will be an impact, and it will be quite interesting to watch. April, anything to add?
I agree with all of that. Absolutely. I think, my belief is we're probably going to see a period of time, even as we kind of start to get back to life pre-COVID-19, where, there was a period of time where it might be dinner and a movie out, and now that might become dinner and a movie in. And, to your point, I think brands have to think about not only potentially altering their physical footprint and really embracing delivery services, takeout, things of that nature, but also, limited time offers, value meals, things of that nature, I think have always been a core part of QSRs, and, especially when they introduce new menu items, things of that nature. I think to speak directly to the question, will that be something that will have to probably continue post-COVID-19? My belief is yes. I think, we don't really know to the degree the economic impact to consumers and how long that's going to last. Hopefully it's a fairly quick rebound, but I do think there will be a period of time where consumers are continuing to place value and priority on how they can have an enjoyable experience through, food, QSR brands. I mean, we're food culture, especially here in America, but it might be for, spending less and having less discretionary income to do so for a period of time.
I love it. I think kind of along those lines, a question from Larry as we're a little bit over and kind of looking to wrap up. This idea of like what will signal the return to normal? Is it hopefully maybe timing around back to school, and how would you recommend brands to look on capitalizing once we start to get back to that normalcy once again? April, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's a good question, but I think it's a hard question because there is still so much unknown. I do think as the kind of restrictions with shelter in place, businesses start to potentially let their workforces come back in, maybe in shifts or stages as schools get back to kind of reopening. I think those are all going to be really important indicators, as well as just watching the economy and how the economy reacts to kind of get back to that new normal. But I also think, the longer that we stay in this time period, as I mentioned, I think we're going to start seeing potentially more permanent shifts in consumer behavior. And, some of the things that people are, kind of experiencing now actually may become more permanent things, and that may become part of our new normal after this. And so I think as a QSR brand, it's some of the things that we've already talked about and really keeping a close pulse on that, because I definitely think it will potentially shift advertising strategies in the channel mix, because we see where consumers are leaning in and how those behaviors are changing now.
Good insights there. I appreciate you both answering the questions and running through some really interesting research. we unfortunately were not able to get to all the questions as we look to wrap up. We'll do our best to follow up with you all individually to address those questions. But I just want to thank April, Amy, for both of you joining us today, and thank you all for joining us to not only dial in, but also for those great questions. When you log out, you'll receive a survey, and I appreciate you giving us feedback on your experience, suggestions on things you'd like to see for future webinars. And as I mentioned, the slides presented, as well as a recording of this webinar, will be sent to you via email. So definitely be on the lookout for that. And I hope you got your fill of comfort food, or the comfort of comfort food for today. And what better industry to dive into next week than pharma and healthcare? So I encourage you all, please stay healthy, stay positive, and maybe think about ordering out and ordering in to treat yourself. So this concludes our presentation for today. I'm Ryan Mancy. This has been a special webinar series brought to you by the Central Institute, and I'm glad that you joined us. Thank you all.